Trees for Bees with Denise Ellsworth. So those of you who have not had the pleasure of listening to Denise's presentations, Denise is the program director of the Department of Entomology with OSU. She's also a big part of the OSU Bee Lab and big fan and resource for anything pollinators. And let's see, did I miss anything that you wanted to talk about, Denise?
That's good.
All right, well, with that being said, I will hand it off to you and let's learn about trees for bees.
All right, super. How's my volume? Sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to come and learn about trees for bees. I'm Denise Ellsworth with the OSU Department of Entomology. I'm kind of based out of Worcester, but I really have a statewide appointment. So I may have seen you in Delaware and Springfield this weekend, coming up in Mason, kind of wherever in the state folks are interested in learning about wild bees, pollinator habitat, and phenology. Excuse me, and phenology are kind of the areas that I spend a lot of time teaching. So I'm glad to be here tonight. I have a long love for trees and bees. My love for trees is longer. I grew up in the Laurel Highlands in Western Pennsylvania under an oak forest. So white oaks are really a key in my heart and in my life. And I've been working with bees with OSU for about the last 12 years. So before I was with the Department of Entomology, I was a county extension educator. So I see some familiar names in the participant list, Greg and Carolyn and Kathleen and others. And I may have met you long ago when I taught horticulture, integrated pest management, and natural resources, and then moved over to entomology in 2012. So tonight we're going to talk about trees, why they're important for pollinators. We're going to do a little review of pollinators. So for some of you who are really into pollinators, this will be very familiar with you, but I kind of want to cover some of the basic ways that pollinators live. And then we'll turn to what pollinators get from, and specifically bees, what they get from trees. We'll walk through some of our most common trees that bloom in Ohio that have important resources for bees, and then I'll share a few resources for all of you as well. So I just love the idea of trees as being so important for pollinators. You know, flowers are that flag that attracts the pollinators, and then the plants offer different kinds of rewards. And trees offer a lot of different rewards that we'll really dig into. But I want to start with some of our common wild bees, just a quick review of bumblebees. I don't know if anybody's seen any queen bumbles yet. I'm guessing most of our audiences, I'm from Northeast Ohio as well. I live in Stark County. I haven't seen any queen bumbles yet. Maybe you have. Actually, I saw one on iNaturalist from a few days ago in Portage County. But soon enough, those queen bumblebees will emerge from their winter hibernacula, and we'll start to see them looking for places to nest. This is one of the reasons why leaving leaves is important for bees and other pollinators, because sometimes that's some nice insulation and protection. And here's a big queen bumblebee who's looking for a dark place to start a nest. So bumblebees can nest on the ground or in the ground. Of course, they're a social bee, so we have queens, workers, and drones. But only that queen bumble spends the winter, survives the winter, and then comes out in spring to start that nest. So sometimes we see bumbles in abandoned mouse nests, sometimes at the base of bunch grasses, like these bunch grasses we had here on the Worcester campus a few years ago. And if you just look down under there, you can see the bumbles who were nesting kind of underneath those blades of grass that fell over from last year. So one of the reasons to kind of leave some of that natural habitat, if you have some bunch grasses, maybe you'll get lucky and some bumbles will move into your landscape. That big fat queen is the one that we see both late summer and fall. And then if she mates, she can spend the winter and she'll be out soon to start her new nest. So we're not going to really talk a lot about honeybees specifically, but of course they're a social bee as well with a queen, worker, and drones. I bet a lot of you are beekeepers, and a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. Fortunately, the trees don't care so much which group the bees are from. They're kind of opening lots of resources to many different bees, and so honeybees will visit many of the trees that we're talking about tonight. Our solitary bees can be either ground nesting or cavity nesting or tunnel nesting. So we'll talk about the ground nesters first. They both have kind of a similar life cycle where we have the adults emerge. Maybe you have these polyester bees or calides, sometimes called tickle bees, because they're very unlikely to sting. But maybe they're a ground nesting bee that you see somewhat often. This image is from the Toledo Botanical Garden. So these bees overwinter in the ground in the nests. They emerge in spring and mate. And then all these little volcanoes that you see there, those little piles of soil is where an individual female cleans out the tunnel where she emerged. Then after she's mated, she gathers pollen and nectar to make that pollen ball, that bee bread, takes that underground in the tunnel and lays her egg. She never meets her offspring. Those solitary bees, the adults are done after about sometimes around 6 weeks or so of adult activity. And then around the time those bees emerge, around the time that they're adults, their parents emerged last year. So many only having one generation per year. So maybe you're lucky enough to have some kind of solitary ground nesting bee. They're very docile. It's very different than ground nesting wasp like yellow jackets. So the other very common type of bee, those solitary bees, are tunnel nesting or cavity nesting. So think of your bamboo wind chimes, maybe some cracks between the bricks on your front porch or the drain holes in your metal patio furniture. Those are common places where some of those tunnel nesting bees may move in, or if you have a bee hotel, those tubes and tunnels are where bees like this leaf cutting bee will move in. She after she mates, the female gathers 30 or 40 slices of leaf. She actually chews those off with her jaws, rolls that leaf piece up, and then flies to wherever that tunnel is. So your bamboo wind chimes, one at a time, taking those leaf pieces up to make these little nursery cells. And inside there, then she's provisioned those with a bee bread and an egg. Again, the mom doesn't meet her offspring. She does all this work at the beginning, and then her offspring emerge. So just some of our basic types of bee lifestyles, and we'll talk about some bees that are associated with some of our different trees. And as I said, those flowers, they're really the flag, and they're trying to attract, reward that pollinator, and repeat. So they really want the pollinators to come, take a little bit of reward. We'll talk about some of our most common rewards from trees. And then they want that pollinator to leave, so hopefully they'll bring back the type of pollen that plant needs. I have a third of an acre, so some of you who had those city lots, I have a small lot as well, but lots of trees planted. There's a lot we can do habitat-wise in a very small space. And sometimes when we're thinking about pollinator habitat, we think meadow. That's kind of the default. But actually the trees are even more important than meadows in late winter and throughout the spring. Our trees kind of fade out into early summer. We don't have as many native trees that are blooming, and that's really when some of our perennials, some other shrubs are important all the way through the fall. But the trees are really key for us here in Ohio in the spring. And so let's talk about some different products and resources that bees get from trees. And of course, we think about the food, right? The bees are foraging, they're getting pollen, that protein source. That's the only place they can get that protein source is from flowers. But they don't just get that protein, they get a lot of other compounds as well. So amino acids, there are vitamins and minerals in that protein. That's all that the bees need to mature as larvae packed in that protein. Nectar we think of as a carbohydrate source, that flight fuel, that energy that bees need. But again, there are a lot of other compounds in there as well. Amino acids, sometimes those amino acids are targeted to butterflies that don't consume pollen or get protein as adults. So sometimes they get that from nectar. Dissolved scent compounds from flowers can be in nectar. So a lot of different chemicals and compounds that are in nectar, not just that great sugar source, that flight fuel. So if we think about honeybees, if you're a beekeeper and your hive is in that central place, those honeybees are foraging out from there. Can be a radius of 3 miles. Bees don't go as far as if they don't have to. But a very small bee can't fly as far from that nest. And so when I talk with landowners, with homeowners or gardeners, and we talk about bee habitat, of course, we're talking about those flowers, getting those flowers close by so bees can forage. But just as importantly, the bees need a place to nest. So if a very small bee, like a yellow-faced bee, can't find a place to nest, they'll never be able to fly far enough to find your flowers. So there's really those two components. We need the flowering part, that food for the bees, but we also need places for those bees to nest. So bees are central place foragers, like this little mason bee peeking out from one of these tunnels. And so the females are leaving that central place. They're foraging out for pollen and nectar and bringing it back then to that nest. And that's really why bees are such critical pollinators, because they're working a general area. They're coming back, they're spreading that pollen around to the flowers that are in need. And I love this study that some researchers in Great Britain did a few years ago. Probably rather small on your screen, but the blue dot in the middle is where the bumblebee nest was brought into this field. And then as you can see on the bottom right image, those bumblebee workers had a little radar tracker glued to their thorax, and then they were tracked on the trips that they made. And so the idea is that that blue dot is the central place, and the bees are working out from that central place. They're making the map, they're looking for forage sources, they're looking for the edges, and they learn those resources and landmarks to find their way back home. So besides what we think of as food, the pollen and nectar, there are other sources of nutrition that bees are getting from trees. And we don't talk a lot about honeydew, or in this case, that's honeydew, which is excrement from an aphid. So many of those soft-bodied insects, like scale insects, aphids, members of the Hemiptera family, they're taking in a lot of sap, and some of that sap is not processed, and they're excreting that. And so bees can actually come and gather that honeydew. And if it's a honeybee, they're making that into honey. Or if it's a non-honeybee that's just using that nectar, that's that carbohydrate source. So honeydew can actually be a pretty important nutrient source depending on the time of year and which kinds of habitat is around. And many of the trees that we don't think of as being important for bee forage, for bee food, like poplar trees. So maybe cottonwoods are, the buds are swelling where you are. They're not quite in bloom for me here in Stark County. But when I was in Columbus last week, cottonwoods were blooming. They have a wind-pollinated flower. It's not really showy, and we don't think of it as being attractive to bees. But bees are gathering that pollen from those catkins, but they can also visit poplar leaves once they emerge, because those leaves have something that we call extrafloral nectaries. And what that means is a nectary, so a place where on the plant where sap or nectar is being exuded that is away from the flowers. So on poplar, these extrafloral nectaries are actually on the leaf. And you can see there the little shiny droplets of nectar that are secreted there. We think that those extrafloral nectaries are really bringing in some of those beneficial insects, so ants and wasps and other predators that may help to clean some of the herbivores, some of the caterpillars or sawflies, other insects that might be eating those leaves. So a way that the plant gives a little bit, offering that nectar to bring in those beneficial insects. So keep that in mind. We'll come to another example in just a few minutes of a tree that offers that extrafloral nectaries. So even when poplars aren't in bloom, those leaves can be offering that nectar. If you are a beekeeper, you know about propolis, which is the sticky resin that bees use to kind of caulk up the hive to seal cracks and crevices. And the main tree that we think of with providing those resins for bees is cottonwood and other poplars. So if you think about those cottonwood buds, you can often see that sticky resin that's covering those buds. So bees are visiting those resins and in the honeybees example, taking that back to the hive to close up those cracks and crevices. But there are other bees that are using those resins as well, usually in their nest. Here are some different examples, and one bee that we sometimes see, maybe this is a bee that's familiar to you, this sculptured resin bee is named because it's gathering those resins, taking it back to a nest. Sometimes they take over carpenter bee nests, and they use those resins there to help build that nest habitat. Those resins can have a lot of antimicrobial qualities. If you think about it, the plant needs to protect itself from fungi, from viruses, sometimes from predation. And so it's providing those compounds that are protecting the tree, and then the bee is taking advantage of it, taking those resins back and benefiting from some of those antimicrobial qualities. Bees can also use trees for pieces of nest building, so that leaf cutting bee gathering those little discs of leaf one at a time. They love especially early season tree saplings with those really tender leaves. So I often see, it looks like somebody came with a hole punch and punched out some of those leaf pieces. This is that leaf cutting bee using her strong jaws to just chew that little leaf disc, roll that up, and then take that back to her tunnel. So here on an ash, also on oak and sugar maple, often on red buds, so those nice soft early season leaf discs. Researchers also think that that antimicrobial quality, those secondary defensive chemicals, are one of the reasons that leaf-cutting bees are using these trees, why they select certain trees to gather those leaf discs, because they may be providing protection for the leaf from predation. And again, the bee kind of benefits by taking those discs back, and the larva gains some protection that way. Other things that trees can provide, male bees often aggregate together. They don't really do a lot outside of the nest. They just kind of hang out till they can find a female to mate. Here are some on some perennials. These aren't up in the canopy, but it's thought that male bees may be using these canopy areas as a place to kind of aggregate as they look for females to mate. Trees can also be important for nest material. So I always think of rotting firewood as a place where I tend to see mason bees nesting. Usually it's places where beetles have kind of moved in and moved out. So there are some tunnels in that wood, and then the mason bees can come in. Of course, they're named mason bees because they gather mud, and they use that mud to kind of wall off, instead of the leaf cutting bee who's using that leaf matter to make that little nursery cell. Mason bees use that mud to build their little nursery cells. That rotting wood can also be great for some of our metallic bees, like our Algochlora bee, the bright green sweat bee. That can be on rotting wood that has fallen, or even rotting branches that are in the trees in the canopy. Those bees can move into that kind of, sort of punky wood. They can move in and nest. If you think of tip-ups in the forest, these can actually be places where soil nesting bees are moving in. So, in a forest, we may not have as many clear areas with soil where those soil nesting bees can nest, but they can also nest in these tip-ups in some of the soil here. And of course, as the roots break down, then that can be places where those wood nesting bees can also move in. It's important to mention that kind of whole forest habitat. So if you're lucky enough to have, and some of you do have many acres, maybe some wonderful woodland habitat, those ephemeral wildflowers are really key in spring for many of our bee species. So there are bees that are feeding in the canopy, there are bees that are feeding in the understory, and then there are bees that are kind of feeding on the edges of that forest. And those understory flowers are really providing a lot of resources at a time when there's not much else in the understory. We have some bees that we call specialist bees. So this may be a specialist bee that's familiar to you, and a flower that is probably familiar to you. This is the spring beauty. Of course, here it looks really big, but it's this tiny little pale pink or white flower in the understory, one of our first blooming native perennials. And this is a specialist bee that has to have the pollen from spring beauty to provision her underground cells for her offspring. So this is really the only plant that she will visit for pollen. She doesn't need pollen as an adult. She's collecting it to take to that tunnel underground, build that little mass of bee bread, and then lay her egg and kind of backfill that little nursery cell. You can see her leg here really full. She has kind of hairy legs, and she gathers in that pollen. Sometimes it's a real light pink color, kind of looks like cotton candy. And she's actually such a good gatherer of that pollen that she may limit the pollen availability of spring beauty for other bees that come along. So she can actually kind of hog some of the pollen that otherwise would provide optimum pollination. So a lot of these bees nesting or gathering forage habitat, the pollen and the nectar there on the forest floor. For bumblebees, forests are quite important, and some recent research has really shined a light on this, how many bumblebees are overwintering on forest edges or in forested areas under leaves. They only spend the winter in a hibernacula that's about 6 inches underground. And it tends not to be in the place where they nested. Can be really difficult for researchers to figure out where bumblebees are spending the winter, and then also where they're nesting. But this forest habitat seems to be really critical for bumblebees. And then I mentioned those queen bumbles, when they emerge, they're looking for places to nest. And those can be in rock walls. So if you're, happen to be lucky enough to be next to some natural rock formations, or you have a rock wall in your garden, those are often places that bumblebees will seek out nest sites. And trees can also provide protection from wind. And so when you're looking for bees, if it's a really windy day, you're just not going to see many bees out there. But in a forested area, they're really getting that windbreak and can forage and move about without that wind problem. So some recent studies, this is a paper by Cass Urban Mead and others. She's a really amazing bee biologist working now with the Xerces Society, who's spent a lot of time up in the canopy gathering bees and studying who's up there foraging. We think about bees and trees. It's hard to see where they might be active. We have to kind of look up into the canopy, kind of at the edges, and hope that maybe we'll catch sight of some of those bees foraging there at the ends of branches. But Cass and her team have actually climbed up into the canopy. They have bee bowls that they put up into the understory and have collected and studied different kinds of bees up there, which trees they're working, which bee species. And so I love that she says that it's clear from the current body of knowledge that any effort to preserve native woody habitats, including the protection of individual trees, will benefit pollinating insects and help maintain the critical services they provide. So for those of you who put in the chat box, I have a little tiny yard, or maybe I have one tree, that tree is still important and it can be great habitat. So don't underestimate the importance of just a few individual trees. So let's think about the role of trees in season-long bloom. This is a study that Dr. Reed Johnson and some of his graduate students conducted a few years ago. Harper McMinn Sauter took lead on this, looking at pollen in and honey samples, and looking at identifying which plants those bees were visiting. And what they found was that these were kind of key trees throughout the spring. So redbud apple or crabapple, cottonwood, cherry, pear, oak, and willow. So just like the cottonwood, the oak and willow tend to be thought of as insect pollinated flowers, and certainly cottonwood and oak, they're producing these catkins and throwing their pollen to the wind. But bees are definitely visiting those trees and gathering that pollen. So even though it's not a showy flower, it's not fragrant, it doesn't have a colorful flag that invites the pollinator, but hungry bees are finding that pollen and adding it to that suite of plants that they're gathering and using for the young. So in this study, they were really looking at those honeybee trees, but found that the cherries, willows, and apples were right there at the top as far as spring importance for honeybees building their colonies. Other studies like this one by Jesse Lanterman and Karen Goodell down at OSU Newark, working out at the wilds. This is a reclaimed strip mine in Cumberland, Ohio. And one of the insights that they unearthed in their research was the importance of these little forest edges. So again, we kind of think of pollinator habitat with that flowery meadow, but the bees need some place to nest. They need some place to kind of rest, possibly spend the winter, and also get protection from wind and other weather. And so this study really keyed in on those small forested spaces and how important they are for bees. So think of that in terms of your neighborhood. Maybe you're in an urban area, maybe you're in a rural area, but there are little patches of trees wherever, whether that's a fence row, and a forested park, a school that has a little, a few trees. Those can be the real nesting resources that bees need. So I mentioned Cass Urban Mead, this a really amazing researcher, and some of her work looks at the importance of those bees, the importance of those trees for lots of different kinds of pollinators. And when we're thinking about our orchard plants and other crops that need pollination, having that forest at the edge of the field can be a really important way for pollinators to come in and work that resource. So this work was really particularly looking at apple orchards, but in other countries, a lot of research has been done with coffee and how important having that tree resource can be then for bees to come in and pollinate that coffee crop. So here's a little screenshot of Cass giving a webinar. If you go to the Xerces website, they have a number of resourced webinars that Cass has given talking about her research and showing how here she is here climbing up into this tree. Here's her insect net that she takes up. Also uses a kind of slingshot to get her bee bowls up into the canopy, and then comparing those different areas, the different trees, and which bees are visiting that resource. So really talking about the importance of how much nectar and pollen is produced in a tree. If you think of that maple that's blooming right now out your window, if you squish down and flatten out that maple, you have thousands and thousands of flowers that, instead of one little cone, maybe you think it's 20 feet wide. You really have this inviting floral resource that's drawing in bees because of that nectar and that pollen. So she talks about a single sugar maple tree that makes 1 billion grains of pollen, and really providing that resource, whether it's a wind pollinated plant or an insect pollinated plant. When we talk about honeybees, they have major and minor food sources. So some plants that tend to offer a lot of pollen and nectar that they visit readily, others that they switch off to that help supplement what the hive is bringing in. So as we talk about some of our spring blooming trees, some of these will be really key for bees. Others, you may have 1 or 2 of these trees in your neighborhood or in your town. There can be bees that are using those trees maybe as a minor food source. So we're going to kind of walk through the season, looking at some of these important trees, thinking about some of our bees that are visiting those trees. First, I said with early season bees, we have those queen bumblebees that will be out after we see our first queen. It'll be about a month before we see the workers, which are going to be much smaller than the queen. So the queen using those ephemeral wildflowers, but also some of these trees that we're going to talk about. And then we have other bees like our mason bees. Down on the bottom left is our an image of our polyester bees. Lots of other mining bees, so some really important spring active bees. If you're not familiar with our phenology calendar, it's produced by OSU, was built with work that Dr. Dan Herms had done over many years to build this kind of list, the sequence list of what's blooming in Ohio and which mostly pest insects can be associated with that bloom time. So if you haven't used this resource before, I invite you to take some time and check it out. This is the perfect time of year to really learn about the phenology calendar because things are just kind of starting to get going. You can kind of learn how phenology works its way through the season and look around you and kind of ground truth what you're seeing there on the calendar. So if you just put GDD and OSU into your browser, this calendar will come up. Anywhere in Ohio, you can put your Ohio zip code in. It defaults out to today's date, but you can put past dates in. So get kind of an idea of what was happening, say this time last year. And if you're familiar with the calendar, we have kind of a new feature called summary. Here, if you click on summary, you get an average of the growing degree day, the accumulated heat for the last 20 years. So a cool way to see how we're doing now in comparison to some earlier years. So what does this have to do with trees and bloom? Well, lots of those, this is all woody plants on the calendar, so native and non-native trees and shrubs. And many of the trees that are important for bees are also listed on the calendar. So the calendar is not specific to trees that are good for pollinators. So many of the trees listed may not offer much at all for pollinators, but it can be a way to kind of track what's blooming when and what you may see outside your window. So what happens when you're here in this view? Oh, sorry. When you're here in this view, you put in your zip code. It drops you in here and shows you what's about to bloom and what's already in bloom. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So what's already in bloom and what's about to come. And then if you click on View Full Calendar, you are dropped into this list here. What's above you is what's already happened, and what's below the black bar is what is yet to happen. So again, just a way to kind of see what's happening around you, to get a feel for what's coming up in bloom. And many of the trees that start off our calendar, silver maple, Cornelian cherry dogwood, red maple, speckled alder, these are trees that we're going to talk about here as being good trees for bees. So we start off with silver maple, followed by red maple. So we don't think often, I think, about how attractive those little tiny flowers are for bees. They are very small, but offering that pollen and nectar resource at a time when there's not much else out there in the landscape. Often the maples, if bees don't come and visit, they may shed kind of a sticky coating around their pollen grains and then throw that pollen to the wind. Maybe you've been noticing a little scratchy eyes, some of those allergens out there blowing around. So red maple, same thing, and a nice nectar source, also offering good pollen for bees. Here's a non-native tree, the Cornelian cherry dogwood. The first yellow blooming tree, I mean, we have forsythia that are shrubs that are in bloom, but if you're seeing a tree form in and covered in yellow flowers, that's going to be Cornelian cherry dogwood. It's really inviting for honeybees. So if you're a beekeeper and you can find some of those Cornelian cherry dogwoods, add them to a landscape where your honeybees can visit them. They are really going to go there on a warm day in late winter, early spring, visit those yellow flowers. You can see this girl here has lots of pollen that she's taking back to that colony. And then later in the season, you do get this cherry-like fruit that a lot of people use for preserves. And so a nice, addition to the ornamental landscape. Alders are blooming around here for me, so I'll bet you have some alders that are sending out those catkins. We have a couple different species that are spring bloomers. Again, not a showy flower. It's not fragrant. It's not particularly colorful as far as a bee is concerned, but it is providing that early season pollen source. So you will see bees visiting these alders and bringing that pollen back to either provision cells for the young or to bring back to the nest. You know, often in the late winter, early spring, I'll get calls, as do other, extension folks and other naturalists. Why are bees visiting my bird feeders or other kind of strange sources of dusty substance? And what we think is that the corn dust and other powdery substances have a taste trigger. It's something that bees taste in, say, alder pollen. It's the same taste they get when they're visiting that bird feeder. So they're gathering that powder to take back to the colony because it tastes like something they know is as a food source. Willows can hard to overstate how important willows are for early season bees. Here we can see just all that yellow pollen in this honeybee visiting that willow catkin. My pussy willows are in bloom right now. This is from my yard this afternoon. So those catkins really open. We have male and female flowers on willows. Excuse me. But bees will visit both male and female flowers. Remember, we talked about our spring beauty and that specialist bee that has to have that pollen. Willows have about 14 species of bee that have to visit and can only gather pollen from willows. So if you add in a pussy willow or one of our native tree willows, you're providing that pollen source that these bees can't get anywhere else. Here's a female flower on a willow, and that yellow on the male catkin producing all that pollen. That's a real visual attractant for bees. They're more likely to visit that male catkin, but they're actually getting nectar from either the male or the female flowers. And it's really interesting if you kind of dig down into the botanical world, there are researchers who are studying those different plants, really kind of teasing out which ones are offering nectar, which are offering pollen. And here's just a study that looked at willow visitation, finding that those male plants had higher visitation, and postulating that could be that color, that yellow that's bringing the bees there. Here's elm. So again, we're real early in the season. Maybe your elms are in bloom right now. Another wind pollinated plant, but something that bees can visit for pollen. And then we're into the cherries. So we have a lot of different cherries in Ohio that are really key for bees. And this goes back to some of that honeybee research talking about that important food resource that cherries and others can provide. And especially in Northeast Ohio, I see a lot of the fire cherry or pin cherry, that Prunus pennsylvanica. And of course, it's hard to see from our perspective if we're not Cass urban mead kind of climbing that tree. But bees are visiting that flower, that very open 5-petal flower, open anthers, providing lots of pollen in that nectar source. And this is a tree that has a quite wide range across the region. But I do see more pin cherries as we go northern in the state, not as many as we get to I-70 and south, but a very early season cherry. Now you may have some ornamental cherries that are blooming. These are also really attractive to different bees. Here we see a honeybee visiting an ornamental cherry. Up here you can just see this queen bumblebee out. She needs that early season food source. She's been spending all winter kind of burning through her fat bodies. She needs to get going with some pollen and the nectar to start her nest. Another member of the rose family, serviceberry. It has a lot of interest, a lot of visitation by different pollinators, some small bees. Here's a honeybee visiting that serviceberry. Kind of a short bloom time, but we have a number of different species of serviceberry, so you can really kind of span the spring if you open the yard to different kinds, different species of serviceberry. And again, that really open flower format with those 5 petals and the anthers and the nectaries open wide. Chokecherry Prunus virginiana, again, another very open flower that's going to bring a lot of bees. And then I mentioned the apples and crab apples, really so important in early spring. Here's some honeybees visiting apples, dipping down deep to get that nectar. And here on the right, we have the pollen in her basket. So getting that important load, whether she's there to gather the nectar, the pollen, or both, crabs and apples are really providing that. In a lot of orchards, the crabapple may be used as a pollinizer. So we know that apples have to cross-pollinate, and they need an apple that's genetically different, but that blooms at the same time. And so often crab apples are used for that purpose. There's a pollinizer that blooms at the same time. It's planted at the end of the row. Honeybees visit those, and other bees visit that pollinizer, that crab, and then take that pollen down the row to provide that pollination for fertilization. Lots of other bees will visit apples as well. So here's some of our mason bees. On the left, our native blue orchard bee. On the right, some of our non-native mason bees that have kind of outcompeted some of those native mason bees. And we tend to see these, they have more of a honey bee sort of resemblance to them, although they're a lot fuzzier and smaller, but not those kind of vibrant blue colors that we see on blue orchard bee. But this is a really important pollinator of those fruit crops: apples, cherries, peaches, pears. This is a chart that Cornell put together that really looks at some of these different orchard trees, so apples, plums, peach, and cherry, and then looks at the bee occurrence through the spring and which bees are active and important for that pollination. So here we have our polyester bees, which are very early, our mason bees, a very early season bee, and we're about to see our queen bumblebees out early, and then we have other bees that kind of span that bloom season. In a study of Pennsylvania and New York orchards, Cornell found about 80 different species of bee that visited those orchards when the apples were in bloom. So a lot of bee diversity brought in by apples and crabs. So even if you don't have an orchard, just having a crab apple can be a great way to bring a resource to your garden in spring and provide some of those pollination services if you're interested in the fruit later. Here's a study that Dr. Reed Johnson and others at OSU did a few years ago when they were trapping pollen from bees, from honeybees. So they had pollen traps on the honeybee hive. They wanted to know which plants bees were visiting over kind of a 2-week period in spring. So they gathered the pollen from the bees' legs. And at that time, they were taking out that pollen, they were sorting it by color, very laborious task, and then making slides of those different pollen grains and keying out, identifying those pollens. So here we have purple dead nettle, dandelion, ash, and hawthorn that were shown to be important in that 2-week period for honeybee visitation. But really one of the most important areas, groups of plants were the fruit trees. So those rosaceous, the apples, the crabs, the hawthorns, and others, the cherries. So really being important in that spring bloom time. Here's a graph that the lab put together that looks at kind of how that bloom changes through that several week period. And when those rosaceous plants are in bloom, that's really where the bees are. They're visiting those apples and cherries and hawthorns, bringing that pollen back. And then switching out, here we have willow, honeysuckles, other plants that are kind of coming in and coming out of bloom, but really the importance of those rosaceous plants highlighted by this research. And again, we see things like ash, so a tree that's wind pollinated primarily, something that's we're seeing less of because of emerald ash borer has taken out so many of our trees. Somebody mentioned in the chat box that they have a lot of dead ash, which can be good habitat. Unfortunately, if we think of the bright side, you can have some bees nesting in that decaying wood. But unfortunately, we've lost a lot of ash, but that pollen resource is something that bees will visit and gather. Okay, so we're still kind of walking through the spring. Here we are at redbud in bloom. A lot of bees visiting redbud. This was one of the trees that was highlighted in that earlier study. And that's when I'm looking for polyester bees. Polyester bees are not a specialist bee. They don't have to go to redbud for pollen, but their emergence seems to sync with the bloom of redbud. And they tend to like redbud. So if you're trying to catch sight of one of those polyester bees, it's pretty likely that you'll see some foraging around if you have a redbud tree. Now we're into our blooming oaks. So again, a wind pollinated plant, but producing, billions of grains of pollen, sending that out to the wind, and that doesn't go unnoticed by bees. We know how important oaks are for birds because of the caterpillars, the other insects that are feeding there on that oak, and what an important piece of the food web that oak is. Here, those catkins releasing all of that pollen into the wind to, among other things, cause some hay fever dismay. So some of those woody plants that Doug Tallamy and others have highlighted as being so important for supporting butterflies and moths are also really important for bees. So if we're planting oaks, willows, cherries, plums, and crab apples, really important, not just for caterpillars and for birds, but also for bees. And then we have birch and poplar, which are wind pollinated, may also be, not quite as important as the oaks and willows, but still important for bees visiting for pollen. So here's our hawthorns. We have a number of different species of hawthorn in Ohio. Again, in some of those studies kind of lumped in with other rosaceous hosts, but offering that open source of pollen and nectar. I was just reading a study about black cherry and how there's not successful black cherry regeneration in some forested areas. And the thought is maybe there's a pollinator gap there, that it's not getting the pollination it needs to have a viable seed in that fruit. But bees will visit black cherry. The next few trees that I'll mention are maybe you only have one or two in your area, maybe a specimen tree or a street tree, but not something you're going to have a whole forest of. But still, they can fill some of the gaps, providing food, that sequence of bloom that allows bees that have a longer foraging cycle, like honeybees and bumblebees, gives them something to switch off onto when other food sources are scarce. So something like hackberry. Here we have black gum. Again, we don't have a lot of black gum in Ohio, but we do definitely have some in forested areas, providing a good resource. Honey locust, sometimes planted as a street tree, called honey locust because of that nectar source. Okay, so now we're kind of through the spring. We're going into kind of late spring and into summer. Our trees are really most important as a forage source in late winter through spring. So we have a kind of a sprinkling of late spring bloomers before the trees really fade out and let the perennials and shrubs kind of take over. And our suite of bees changes as well. Of course, we have some bees that are active throughout the season, those honeybees and bumblebees. But we have other bees that are kind of coming in to activity. They may be more summer active bees. We have other bees that are more fall active bees. So again, kind of spanning that season with bloom is important as we look at that bee diversity. Tulip tree, or also called tulip poplar, a really rich nectar source. So if you're a beekeeper, you may be putting the honey supers on when tulip tree is in bloom, trying to gather that tulip tree honey. Yellowwood, a member of the legume family. That bloom is sweet and fragrant and brings in a lot of bees, but we don't tend to see a lot of yellowwood. It depends where you are in the state, especially if you have an arboretum or not. But consider planting a yellowwood. It is a native tree, something that bees are going to find. Black locust, another native tree. This can be somewhat of a bully, sometimes considered a native invasive, but it does have a really rich nectar source. And so again, a plant that if we have a good heavy bloom of black locust, beekeepers are really happy. The bees are bringing lots of that nectar back. Then we're into our catalpas. So that big open white flower has evening visits by moths, but daytime visits by some of our bees, including carpenter bees and bumblebees, also honeybees, visiting that catalpa. And the plant actually changes its nectar reward from day to night. So in the day, for bees that can take a higher sugar concentration, they have, if you will, kind of shorter and stubbier tongues. Then moths that visit at night, they can't kind of suck up a very concentrated sugar solution. And so the tree kind of thins out the nectar resource that it offers for the moth at night, then switching back in the day for some of those bee visitors. Catalpa is one of the plants that has extra floral nectaries. There are actually quite a few different plants, but this is one of the trees that I wanted to highlight that has on the underside of the leaf, kind of on those leaf veins, it provides that nectar source. And we can see here some wasps visiting those leaves. The wasps are coming to get that flight fuel. They need that nectar source. And then they may be cleaning off caterpillars or other herbivores that are there visiting the catalpa. So just about done with our spring blooming trees. Here we have little leaf linden, a common street tree, a non-native tree, but a really wonderful fragrance. We see lots of bees visiting little leaf linden. Here's the native cousin, basswood. If you have a forested area and there's a way you can incorporate more basswood, I feel so lucky for you if you have basswood already, a really wonderful sweet fragrance when this flower is in bloom. And you can literally hear the trees buzzing. There'll be so many bees visiting those flowers. So that kind of finishes off our native tree bloom season. Another one tree to think about for your ornamental landscape, seven sunflower. This is more of a summer blooming tree. It is visited by a lot of bumblebees and honeybees, and it can be a nice ornamental flower addition. If you happen to be from the southern stretches of the state, there's been a lot of work, of course, in other states looking at pollinator plants. Here's a study out of Kentucky that really highlighted some of those trees that are more appropriate for some southern stretches. Some familiar plants to us also, the Cornerian cherry dogwood, the Huygen cherry, the yellowwood here, and linden. But plants that tend to do better in those warmer zones. So whether you live in a rural area or you live in an urban area, are there ways that you can incorporate a few more trees into your landscape or into your forest, or protect the trees that you do have, especially trees that are really providing a lot of those resources for bees? If you're going to do one thing, maybe you can plant one of those bee-loving trees in your landscape, or you can help your community when they're doing street tree plantings, help them select some trees that are providing benefits to bees. Lesson learned, you can possibly say they're beneficial to pollinators like butterflies, because people get worried about bees, but we know that when bees are busy shoppers on flowers, they're not so worried about us, but butterflies tend to be a little more palatable. Just a couple resources for you. So we do have a fact sheet on Ohio trees for bees, including most of the trees that we talked about tonight. If you have a forested area, here's a publication from the USDA on ways to, again, kind of manage your forest and favor those trees that are providing good resources for bees. And this is my contact. So I'm at blab.osu.edu, and my email, ellsworth.2@osu.edu. So I invite you to contact me with questions or comments, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time for that as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Denise. And I know we've answered a few questions in the chat, but if you have any more, let's get them out there for Denise. So please put them in the chat. And we also have, if you haven't checked out the chat lately, we have a couple of links for documents and the phenology calendar. Does the state offer a service to come to our property and help plan tree plantings and such?
So there are foresters that are active across the state through ODNR, and you can find your service forester. There are urban foresters as well.
Yep. All right. Let's see. First of all, so just overall, how are bees doing? I mean, I know that pollinators in general are declining.
Well, it depends which bees you mean. So we have about 450 species of bee in Ohio, so just incredible bee diversity. We probably know the most about honeybees, bumblebees maybe second, but so many other bees, it's hard to know how all the different bees are doing. Some like some bumblebees are really compatible with urban and suburban landscapes, and so even in a really kind of urban area, we can have good bee diversity. We can have over 100 different species of bee. I think it's important to remember that all the steps that we take in our own backyard can help bees. So adding more flowers, thinking about that nest habitat, protecting bees from pesticides, all really key to have a healthy bee community.
Yep. Even a little bit helps. Every little bit helps. Every private yard, turning some of your lawn back into natives is going to help. Another question is, I have a lot of witch hazel on my property. How many bees, what kind of bees are using those?
So I don't actually see a lot of bees on witch hazel. I do see some honeybees on witch hazel. That doesn't mean they're not out there, right? When I'm not looking or when other eyes aren't on it. Um, One thing that's helpful with really all kinds of natural history, but all of you are kind of thinking about bees, you have trees, you have flowers. If you can take pictures of what you're seeing and upload those to iNaturalist, particularly if they're bees or you think it's a bee, that really helps build that resource of observation so we can get a better sense of what's happening out there across the state. And so often I will kind of review the Ohio Bee Atlas, which is a project on iNaturalist, and see which bees are visiting which flowers. It doesn't mean that those are favorite flowers of those bees, but somebody has taken a picture, right? Somebody has seen this bee on that flower. So it's a great way to really learn about bees that are out there and which plants they may be visiting. Somebody mentioned that I didn't talk about buckeyes or bottlebrush buckeye. And it's like picking your favorite children. I actually had buckeye in the talk and decided to just for time's sake kind of cut that out. So again, not a really major source of forage, but buckeyes can be really inviting. They have those great petal colorations. That's to bring the pollinators in. Bottlebrush buckeye, I see lots of small bees on bottlebrush buckeye, so some of those sweat bees and other small dark bees on bottlebrush buckeye, both great plants, great for other forms of wildlife, for butterflies visiting for nectar as well.
So are there any trees that are harmful to bees?
So sometimes so it's a good segue after buckeye. So sometimes people talk about buckeye and they say, well, doesn't buckeye have toxic nectar for bees? It's actually the California buckeye, but the Ohio buckeye gets blamed because people think, well, if it's a buckeye, it must be harmful for bees. So the Ohio buckeyes, so not just Ohio, but our native buckeyes, not harmful to bees. It's that California buckeye that can cause some hive problems, some health problems for honeybees in California.
All
Bees,
right.
because they can taste bitter, they tend to stay away from substances that that may be harmful. Unfortunately, they can't taste pesticides and know that they are harmful, so they may gather pesticides that can harm the bee or harm the colony. But as far as the plant products, bees can make some choices there because of taste.
Let's see. The question was, will the PowerPoint be available? I know that the recording will be available on Geauga Soil and Water's website, and she will probably have other resources there.
Yes, we will be recording this. We will be sending out the resources, and we're actually going to have a resource document that has a lot of these links as well, and that were in the chat. So it'll all be in one place, and we'll actually be emailing that to you as well.
Awesome. Let's see. What about evergreens?
So evergreen pollen doesn't seem to be something that bees want to collect. So of course it floods the air with that windborne pollen, but doesn't seem to be something that bees are bringing back as a food resource. They will sometimes gather those resins, again for use in nesting, but they don't seem to be eating that pollen.
Trees for
I see
wet areas.
Sure. So, so think of trees that you see in a wetland. So something like red maple, maple having a lot of really good pollen and nectar producing flowers. Something like buttonbush, a swamp shrub, is inviting to different kinds of bees. And because it has little shallow flowers, it tends to bring greater bee diversity from some of those small bees. So think of some of those flowering plants in that ecosystem that you're trying to duplicate.
Pin oak and swamp white oak.
Sure, right. Good pollen sources.
Oh, let's see.
Oh, I
So
see there's some magnolias. So
yeah,
magnolia, again, one of the children that I cut out of the slide just because of time. Star magnolia, our saucer magnolia can be a pollen source. They tend not to be really high on the list, not extremely inviting, but you will see bees on those plants, especially when it's, nice and sunny. Those flowers are open and there may not be a lot of other flowers offering resources.
and then the only other two I
Sycamore
saw
is
was sycamore and chestnut. Yep.
Yeah, so chestnut, definitely, you definitely will see bees on chestnut, the Chinese chestnut. Our native chestnut also had a specialist bee associated with it. And so as some of that chestnut work is happening, maybe there'll be some better habitat for those, the return of those native chestnut. So chestnut, yeah, very important. Sycamore doesn't seem to be so important. It tends to be wind pollinated, and it's not one of those trees that you see in the studies of even the wind pollinated trees are making the cut. We don't seem to hear much about sycamore.
All right. And Natalie mentioned black gum again. So, yep, very important tree and good for wet areas, right? For wetter areas, I think. Actually, yeah. It is well adapted for lots of places. All right. I think we've covered all the questions.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for coming and learning about trees and bees. Add a few more trees to your landscape this year.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much, Denise.
Thanks everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.